Why did you pick that specific brand of coffee this morning? Or decide to stream that particular show last night? Every single day, we make dozens of these little choices as consumers, and they might feel totally random, but it turns out there's a fascinating science behind it all. So let's dive in and really unpack the hidden logic behind why we buy what we buy.
So here's our game plan. We're going to build this whole thing from the ground up. We'll start with the most fundamental rule of buying. Then we'll look at some pretty wild exceptions to that rule. After that, we'll figure out how to measure our reactions to price changes, dig into the science of satisfaction, and then finally, we'll pinpoint that mathematical sweet spot for any purchase you make.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the basic law of demand. This is the absolute bedrock, the one idea that probably explains more about our day-to-day economic lives than anything else.
To get us started, just think about this really simple question. Let's say your favorite pizza slice suddenly jumps from, $3 to $6. What do? Well, you'd probably buy less of it, right? Maybe you'd only grab it once a week instead of twice, or you just find a cheaper place. See? You're already thinking like an economist.
That little bit of intuition is exactly what economists call the law of demand. And the key phrase here is inverse relationship. It's simple. When the price goes up, the amount people are willing to buy goes down. And that last part, assuming all other factors remain constant, is super important. Economists call it ceteris paribus, which is just a fancy way of saying we're pretending nothing else in the entire world changes, so we can just focus on the price. And this is what it looks like in picture form. This is the classic demand curve, based on Alfred Marshall's work way back in the 1890s. You've got the price on the vertical axis and the quantity on the horizontal. As the price of that pizza slice drops, you move along the line, and the quantity we're willing to buy goes up. That downward slope perfectly captures the whole idea. It's simple, but it's incredibly powerful.
Okay, but what happens when that simple, powerful rule gets completely broken? Let's jump into Section 2 and look at the really fascinating exceptions to the law of demand. This is where things get interesting. Now check this out, because this is where things get really weird. These are two scenarios where the demand curve actually slopes upwards. On the left, you've got Veblen goods. Think super high-end luxury items like a designer handbag or a sports car. For these things, a higher price actually makes them more desirable. The price tag itself is the point. It's a status symbol. Then on the right, you have something totally different, Giffen goods. These are basic staple foods in very poor communities. If the price of, say, potatoes goes up, a family might have so little money left that they have to stop buying more expensive things like meat and end up buying even more of the now pricier potatoes just to get enough calories to survive.
Now, people often get Giffen goods confused with something else called inferior goods, but they are not the same thing. This table breaks it down perfectly. The absolute key difference is the demand curve slope. For a Giffen good, when the price goes up, demand also goes up. For a normal inferior good, when the price goes up, demand still goes down like you'd expect. The inferior part just means that as your income goes up, you buy less of it. Like maybe you'd stop buying instant ramen and start buying fresh pasta instead.
So we know that for most things, a change in price causes a change in demand. But the next obvious question is, by how much? And that brings us right to Section 3, measuring consumer reactions, where we get to meet the concept of elasticity.
Elasticity sounds kind of technical, but it's really just a word for responsiveness. Think of it like a rubber band. How much does demand stretch or shrink when the price changes? If a price goes up by 10%, does demand plummet or does it barely budge? Elasticity is the tool that gives us that answer, and you can bet companies are obsessed with this when they're pricing, well, everything.
And this slide shows you the whole spectrum of how we might react. On the far right, you've got something that's perfectly inelastic. The demand curve is a vertical line. Think of life-saving medicine. The price could change a lot, but the demand stays the same because people need it. Then on the other extreme, you have perfectly elastic goods. Most things, of course, are somewhere in the middle. Something like gasoline is pretty inelastic. You kind of have to buy it to get around. But your choice between two different brands of soda, that's way more elastic, because if one gets more expensive, you'll just buy the other one.
Okay, so we've covered how we react to price, but let's go a little deeper. Why do we even want things in the first place? This brings us to Section 4, the science of satisfaction. And to talk about that, we need to unpack this idea of utility.
Utility is basically just the economist's word for satisfaction or happiness. But how in the world do you measure happiness? That's a huge question, right? For a long time, there were two main ways of thinking about it. The cardinal approach said, sure, we can measure it. Let's just assign it a number. Like an apple gives you 10 utils of happiness. But the ordinal approach said, no way, that's impossible. All you can do is rank your preferences. You know you like coffee more than tea, but you could never say by exactly how much.
And this graph shows a really powerful idea. Bringing back our pizza example. That bottom curve, marginal utility, is the happiness you get from each individual slice. That first slice is amazing, right? The second one is still pretty good. But by the time you get to the 10th slice, you might actually feel sick. Its utility could be negative. The top curve just adds all of that up. Your total satisfaction goes up, hits a peak, and then actually starts to go down. That right there is the law of diminishing marginal utility. All right, let's put all the pieces together. We know what we want, that's utility. We know how we react to price, that's demand and elasticity. So now it's time for the big finale in Section 5, finding the buying sweet spot. Economists call this consumer equilibrium.
Let's build this up one step at a time. First, we have what's called an indifference curve. Just think of this as a map of your desires. Let's say you're choosing between coffee and donuts. Any single point on this curve, whether it's 3 coffees and 1 donut or 1 coffee and 4 donuts, gives you the exact same level of happiness. You'd be equally happy or indifferent between any of those combinations. This is all about what you want.
Okay, so that's the dream. Now let's add a nice big dose of reality. This straight line is called the budget line. It shows every possible combination of coffee and donuts that you can actually afford with the cash you have. This is your constraint. Anything above that line is, sadly, out of reach.
And here it is. This is the magic moment where it all comes together. The graph basically lays your map of desires over your map of what's affordable. To get the absolute most bang for your buck, the most happiness for your money, you find the one single point where your budget line just barely kisses the highest possible happiness curve it can reach. That spot, right there at point E, is your sweet spot. It's the perfect, optimal combination of stuff that makes you happiest, given what you can actually afford.
You know, ultimately, this all leads to a really simple but powerful idea from an economist named Paul Samuelson. He basically said, look, we don't need to do complex brain scans to figure out what people want, we just have to watch what they do. His theory, revealed preference, says that if we just observe that you chose product A instead of product B, we can logically conclude that you prefer A. Your actions speak louder than words.
So, let's do a quick recap of the big takeaways. First, we have the law of demand. As price goes up, demand goes down. Simple. But we know there are fascinating exceptions for luxury and staple goods. We learned about elasticity, which measures how much our demand reacts to a change. We know our goal is always to maximize utility, or our satisfaction, and we find our perfect choice at the equilibrium point, that sweet spot where what we want meets what we can actually afford. I know it's a lot to take in, but it brings us to one last thought. The next time you're in a store, and you're staring at 2 different options on a shelf, trying to decide, will you see it just a little bit differently? Will you maybe think about that invisible map of your preferences, just touching the hard, straight line of your budget? It's definitely something to think about.